The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the dusty fairground, and Minnie Holloway stood on the wooden platform in the blazing Texas sun of April 1878, feeling every one of the 37 pairs of male eyes in the crowd slide past her as if she were made of glass. Not one of them lingered. Not one of them held. She had known this would happen. She had told herself, walking the 2 miles into Caldwell from the Holloway homestead that morning, her good dress pressed and her dark hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, that she would not feel it. She had promised herself that the indignity would wash off her like creek water, that she was above the humiliation of being paraded in front of men who were looking for land and cattle connections more than they were looking for a wife. The spring bride auction in Caldwell, Kansas, was a well-known affair by 1878, a tradition started when the cattle drives first brought money and men to the territory, and the women of the county had agreed, some with hope and some with desperation, to let themselves be considered. Minnie had come with desperation wearing the clothes of hope. The Holloway farm was dying. Her father, Thomas Holloway, had died of fever the previous November, leaving behind 40 acres of unbroken debt, a mule named Curtis who was half blind, and Minnie, who was 24 years old and fully alone. She had no brothers, no mother, no cousins within riding distance. The bank in Caldwell, operated by a man named Gerald Prentice who had the kind of smile that made your skin feel wrong, had given her until June to pay the note on the property or surrender the deed. The note was $420. She had 43, so here she was. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Dale Figgins who wore a red cravat that had clearly seen better years, was calling out her qualities as if she were a mare at the livestock barn. He told the assembled ranchers and farmers that Minnie Holloway was 24, that she was healthy, that she could cook and sew and manage a household ledger, that she had worked a farm since she was old enough to hold a hoe. He told them her family had been in Kansas for 11 years, that the Holloway name was honest, and that any man taking on the Holloway property as part of a marriage arrangement would be getting solid acreage with good water access. He did not mention the debt. Of course he did not. The men in the crowd looked at her and looked away. She watched them do it, one by one. She watched their eyes pass over her like she was a fence post, something noted and immediately dismissed. She was not beautiful in the way the frontier valued beauty. She was not small and soft and golden-haired. She was tall and angular, with dark eyes that people had called severe more than once in her life, and her hands showed every year she had spent working, calloused and capable. She knew what the men in this crowd were looking for. They wanted young. They wanted pretty. They wanted uncomplicated. She was 24 and looked every year of it, and she suspected she looked complicated from 50 feet away. Then she saw him. He was standing at the far left edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the other men, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, and his hat tilted at an angle that suggested he had not put it on carefully that morning. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate whatever was available, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. His shirt was clean, but his boots were dusty, which told her he had ridden a fair distance to be here. He looked to be perhaps 28 or 30 years old, not a boy but not yet settled into the weathered permanence of the older ranchers around him. And he was looking directly at her, not past her, not through her, at her. Minnie felt the force of it like a physical thing, like walking into a cold current in a warm river, unexpected and startling and impossible to ignore. She could not have explained, even later, why his gaze felt so different from the polite disinterest of the others. But where every other man had looked and moved on, this one stayed. His eyes, which she could see even from the platform, were a shade of gray-green that caught the April light strangely, did not waver. He was not looking at her with hunger or appraisal. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they already understand, something they recognize without needing an introduction. It terrified her and steadied her at the same moment. Dale Figgins finished his listing of her attributes and asked for opening bids. The silence stretched out like a hot afternoon. Two men made half-hearted sounds that were not quite offers. One of them shook his head before the auctioneer could even finish writing his number down. The other rescinded his offer when he learned the debt attached to the property, which Figgins was legally obligated to disclose upon direct inquiry, and which had apparently been inquired about. Minnie stood in the sun and kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and thought about the $43 she had in the tin box under her bed and the $180 she owed on the mule alone, and felt the floor of her future opening up beneath her. Then the man at the edge of the crowd uncrossed his arms. He stepped forward, not urgently, not as if he were making a declaration. He moved with the unhurried quality of someone who has made up his mind about something quietly and entirely on his own terms, without needing the approval or attention of the people around him. He stopped just in front of the auctioneer's table and said, in a voice that was not loud but carried easily in the way that calm voices sometimes do, that he would like to make a proper offer, and that he would need a moment to speak with Miss Holloway directly before he did. Dale Figgins blinked. This was not standard procedure, but the man's tone was one of those tones that did not invite argument. Figgins looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at the man. She said yes. His name was Frank Calloway, and he had come to the spring auction in Caldwell because his neighbor, a cheerful widower named Hector Brody, had told him 2 weeks prior that he absolutely should not go, and Frank had made a habit since childhood of doing exactly the things that people told him he absolutely should not do. He had not come intending to bid on anyone. He had come partly out of boredom, partly because he needed to pick up a crate of nails and a bag of feed corn from the Caldwell supply store anyway, and partly because something in the way Hector had said it, with that particular note of overconfidence that suggested Hector had already decided it would be funny, had pricked at Frank in a way he could not quite dismiss. He was a rancher. He had a property of approximately 260 acres 6 miles southwest of Caldwell, land he had spent 6 years building up from a dry and difficult quarter section into a functioning cattle operation with a proper house, and a good well and a small herd of longhorns that he drove to the railhead in Wichita every fall. He was not rich. He was not poor. He was the specific kind of steady that the frontier called lucky and Frank called bone-tired, because it had cost him almost everything he had to get this far. He had not come looking for a wife. But he had looked at Minnie Holloway standing on that platform, straight-backed and dark-eyed with her chin raised against a crowd that was ignoring her as thoroughly as if she had asked them to, and something in him had gone very, very still. He recognized something in her that he could not name immediately. He would think about it later, lying in the dark in his too-quiet house, and he would decide that what he had recognized was the particular quality of a person who has decided to survive something even as it is happening to them. She was not pretending the auction was pleasant. She was not performing ease or warmth or accessibility. She was simply standing there, fully herself, being looked past by men who did not have the sense to understand what they were looking at, and she was refusing to collapse under the weight of their indifference. That refusal was one of the most quietly remarkable things Frank had ever seen. He stepped forward. They spoke at the corner of the fairground, slightly removed from the crowd, while Figgins fanned himself with a paper and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that nothing in Kansas moved on schedule. Frank did not waste time on pleasantries, partly because he was not good at them, and partly because Minnie's expression suggested she did not have patience for them either. He told her his name. He told her his acreage and his herd count and the honest state of his finances. He told her about the 2-room house that was actually 3 rooms if you counted the linta he had finished building in March, and about the well that ran cold and clear even in August, and about the neighbor Hector Brody who would not stop offering unsolicited opinions about Frank's life. Minnie listened to all of this without interruption, and when he stopped talking she said, "Why are you telling me this?" Frank looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Because if I am going to make an offer on your behalf, I think you deserve to know exactly what you would be agreeing to." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Minnie said, "The property carries $420 in bank debt. The bank is Gerald Prentice's bank and he will not extend the note past June." Frank said, "I know Gerald Prentice. What's the land like?" she told him. She told him everything: the acreage and the water rights and the deteriorating south fence and the soil quality and the half-blind mule, and the debt to the man who sold them the mule and the 24 chickens, and the kitchen garden that had good drainage. She told it without apology or softening, facts laid out plainly, the way a person presents a business arrangement rather than a courtship. Frank listened to everything she said, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment in the way that suggested he was thinking rather than stalling. He said, "I am not going to make you an auction offer, Miss Holloway." Minnie felt the ground shift under her feet again. He said, "But I would like to propose a different arrangement if you are willing to hear it." She was 24 years old and had $43 and a debt she could not pay, and a farm she could not keep by herself, and a June deadline moving toward her like a storm front. She said, "I am listening." He said he had been considering for some time that his operation needed a formal partnership to make it fully viable long-term. He had the cattle and the land and the infrastructure, but managing the domestic side of a working ranch alone, while also handling the herd, was a problem he had not solved. He said he understood this was a strange way to approach the matter, but he was not interested in purchasing a wife from an auctioneer. He was interested in proposing to a woman who had chosen to be there, if she was willing to make that choice, and he thought she deserved to hear the facts and make up her own mind rather than be bid on like a piece of property. He then said something that Minnie would think about for many years afterward. He said, "I noticed that every man here looked past you, and I want you to know that I think that says something significant about every man here and nothing at all about you." The April sun was very bright. Somewhere behind them, a horse stamped its feet, and the crowd murmured and Figgins cleared his throat in a carrying way. Minnie Holloway stood in the dust and the light and felt something inside her chest, something she had been pressing down with both hands for a very long time, loosened by one single degree. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I think we should talk further." They talked further. They talked for an hour at the corner of the Caldwell fairground, while the auction went on around them, and people cast curious looks in their direction, and Figgins eventually moved on to other business. They did not talk about feelings or attraction, or any of the soft vocabulary of courtship, because neither of them was the kind of person who started there. They talked about water rights and seasonal grazing, and the price of beef in Wichita and the terms of the Holloway debt, and whether the mule Curtis, despite being half-blind, had any remaining useful life. They talked about practical things, and gradually, as the talking continued, the practical things began to carry warmth in them, the way a fire carries warmth without you being able to point to the exact moment the wood caught. By the time they agreed to a formal courtship, Minnie had learned that Frank Calloway had come to Kansas from Missouri at the age of 22 with $100 and the stubbornness of a man who has something to prove, that he had spent 2 years working cattle drives before saving enough to put a down payment on his land, that he had a dark past in Missouri that he summarized with the single sentence, "My father was not a good man," and did not expand upon, and that he had not spoken to his family in 6 years. She had learned that he read when he could get books, which was not often, that he kept his word as a matter of personal principle rather than social obligation, and that he was the kind of person who, when confronted with a woman being publicly ignored by a crowd of men who should have known better, stepped forward rather than looked away. Frank had learned that Minnie had managed the Holloway farm largely by herself for the last 2 years while her father's health declined, that she could calculate a full season's accounts in her head without paper, that she had a temper she kept on a very short and deliberate leash, and that she had once, 2 years ago, walked to Caldwell alone at night during a thunderstorm to confront Gerald Prentice about a fraudulent interest calculation on the family's loan, and had been so precise and so cold in her argument that Prentice had corrected the figure without a word. Frank said, when she told him that story, "Good." It was not a flowery compliment. It was simply good, said with the quiet conviction of someone who meant exactly that and nothing less. Minnie found that she liked it considerably more than flowers would have been. The formal courtship lasted 3 weeks, which by the standards of 1878 in Kansas was not unusual. The frontier did not operate on the leisurely timeline of Eastern courtship, where a man might call upon a woman for a year before the question of marriage came up. Out here, spring was planting time, and summer was work time, and fall was harvest, and winter was survival. And anyone waiting on the calendar to make the right move was going to find the calendar had moved on without them. Frank rode to the Holloway property every third day. He told himself the first time he did it that he was assessing the land and the state of the debt, which was true. He also brought a new bag of feed corn, which was nominally a loan against the eventual resolution of accounts, which was partially true. And he spent 4 hours helping repair the south fence, while Minnie worked alongside him without being asked, and without any particular fuss, handing him posts and working the wire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, which was entirely true, and also the thing that made him ride home that evening in a state of considerable internal disruption. He was not a man who had many illusions about himself. He knew he was difficult in the specific way that men who have survived difficult things are difficult, careful and private, and slow to give anyone access to the interior rooms of himself. He had told himself for 6 years that a solitary life was a reasonable life, that the ranch was enough, that the work was enough, that the quiet in the evenings when the cattle were settled and the land was dark and still was not loneliness but only peace. He had been lying to himself, he realized now, with remarkable thoroughness. Minnie Holloway was not soft. She was not accommodating in the way that made things easy. She argued with him on the second visit about the best method for rotating his cattle between his pastures and the Holloway acreage if they were to combine operations, and she was not deferential about it. She was direct and specific and right, which he acknowledged after a moment of honest consideration, and which made her look at him with an expression of slight surprise, as if she had been braced for a different kind of response. He suspected she had argued with men before who did not know how to hear a woman be right about cattle management without taking it as a personal affront. He was not that man. He was interested in what worked. He was interested in her. Both of those things were true, and he was beginning to accept that they were not separable. On the 4th visit, near the end of the 2nd week, he found her at the kitchen table in the early morning with the farm's account ledger open and a pencil in her hand, and an expression on her face that told him exactly how bad the numbers were before she said a word. He sat down across from her, and she turned the ledger to face him, and they went through it together, the full picture, every debt and every asset and every calculation, for 2 hours. It was not a romantic scene by any conventional measure. It was 2 people looking at a very difficult problem and deciding together how to solve it. But the way she bit her bottom lip slightly when she was concentrating, and the way she had tucked one strand of dark hair behind her ear so she could see the figures clearly, and the way she occasionally said his name, just Frank, in the middle of a calculation, the way you say the name of someone you have already gotten used to. These things were doing considerable work on him that had nothing to do with ledgers. After the accounting was done, she made coffee on the cast iron stove, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she probably used when she was alone, and she poured him a cup and set it down in front of him, and he said, before he could think better of it, "I would like to ask you to marry me, Minnie, and I would like to do it now rather than waiting another week because I don't see the point in waiting when I'm certain." She had the coffee cup halfway to her lips. She set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone controlling a reaction. She said, "You're certain?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him across the worn kitchen table with those dark eyes that he had already decided were not severe at all but only deeply, startlingly alive. And she said, "I need to know what you mean by certain, Frank, because I have been in this situation before, at an auction, in front of a crowd, and I would like to understand what you mean when you say that word." He understood what she was asking. She was asking whether he was certain about the land arrangement or certain about her. She was asking whether she was a solution to a practical problem or something else entirely. She was asking, with the precision of someone who has been hurt by ambiguity, for clarity. He said, "I mean you, Minnie. The property is part of it and I won't pretend otherwise because you wouldn't believe me and I wouldn't respect myself for saying it. But I mean you. I have been sitting across from you for 3 weeks thinking that I have never met anyone I wanted to talk to as much as I want to talk to you. And I have been sitting across from you for 3 weeks thinking that I would like to be the person you talk to every day for the rest of your life. That is what I mean." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside and the cast iron stove ticking with heat. Minnie Holloway, who had stood on a public platform in the April sun and been looked past by 37 men, who had spent 2 years keeping a dying farm alive by force of will, who had walked to a bank at night in a thunderstorm, and argued a fraudulent calculation down to zero with nothing but her own arithmetic and her refusal to be dismissed, sat at her kitchen table, and for one unguarded moment let something genuinely warm cross her face. She said yes. They rode to the county clerk in Caldwell the following Monday and filed the marriage intention. It was a practical document, 2 names and a date and a signature, and it was also the beginning of the rest of both their lives, though neither of them would have said it quite that way. They married on the first Saturday in May of 1878 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was not much of a church. It was a wooden building with a drafty corner and a bell that had cracked during the previous winter, but Reverend Gaines performed the ceremony with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested he was glad to be conducting a wedding, rather than the more frequent business of frontier funerals. Hector Brody attended and grinned the entire time with the supreme satisfaction of a man who believes his unsolicited advice has been the decisive factor in someone else's happiness, which Frank allowed him to believe, because arguing would have taken more energy than it was worth. Minnie wore a dress she had made from a bolt of blue calico she had been saving for something she had never been sure of, and she carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning, which was entirely in keeping with everything about her. And Frank thought she was the most composed person he had ever seen at a wedding, including his own, and then caught himself and amended that to especially including his own, because his composure was considerably more precarious than hers. He said the words of the ceremony in a steady voice, and meant every one of them. She said them back in a voice that was not loud but was entirely steady, the voice of someone who does not make promises they do not intend to keep. They drove back to Frank's ranch, which was now their ranch, in a wagon with Minnie's possessions loaded behind them, which were not many. The kitchen things and the account ledger and a small box of her mother's sewing items and the mule Curtis who walked behind the wagon on a lead rope and regarded everything around him with the philosophical detachment of the half-blind. The Holloway property would be dealt with through the debt settlement, which Frank had arranged with a visit to Gerald Prentice that he described to Minnie only as direct, and which Minnie did not ask him to elaborate on because the expression on his face when he came home from it suggested the matter had been resolved satisfactorily, and she trusted his judgment. The ranch was better than she had expected. She had built a picture of it from his descriptions that was honest and unembellished, and the reality was honest and unembellished, which meant it was exactly what he had said it was. The house was solid, built from good timber with a proper chimney and windows with real glass, which in 1878 Kansas was not to be taken for granted. The well was where he had said it was, and the water was as cold and clear as he had promised. The herd was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 60 longhorn cattle grazing in the south pasture, but they were healthy animals and the grass was good. She walked through the house with the particular attention of someone calculating what needed to be done, and Frank watched her do it from the doorway, and she caught him watching and said, "I am making a list." He said, "I figured," she said. "The lean-to is useful, but the door hangs wrong." He said, "I know. I built it in March and I was in a hurry," she said. "I can fix it," he said. "I know that too." The first weeks were the particular kind of learning that comes from living alongside someone you do not yet know in all their daily dimensions. Minnie discovered that Frank woke before dawn every morning without apparent effort, already fully alert, which was either admirable or unsettling depending on the time. Frank discovered that Minnie kept accounts of everything, not just money but time and materials and yield and weather patterns, in a series of ledgers that she maintained with a precision that made his own records look like rough sketches by comparison. Minnie discovered that Frank was a considerably better cook than she had expected, and that he had strong opinions about the correct way to prepare beans that he defended with more feeling than he applied to most topics. Frank discovered that Minnie had a laugh she kept at very close range, not given out freely, but when it came it was sudden and genuine, and completely transformed her face in a way that did something extremely specific to his composure. He spent a fair amount of time in those first weeks trying to make her laugh. He was not bad at it, which surprised them both. The work of combining the two operations was substantial. The Holloway acreage, once the debt to Prentice's bank had been settled, gave them nearly 300 acres in total, and the water access from the Holloway Creek combined with Frank's well made them one of the better positioned operations in the county for dry season grazing. Minnie took over the management of the combined accounts entirely within 2 weeks, not because Frank could not manage them, but because it became immediately clear that she was significantly better at it, and Frank was the kind of person who valued what worked over what was easy for his pride. He told her this directly. He said, "I'm giving you the books because you're better at it than I am, and there's no point in pretending otherwise." Minnie looked at him for a moment with that particular expression she had, the one that meant she was recalibrating something internal. She said, "Most men wouldn't say that." He said, "I know." She took the books. By June they had developed the specific rhythms of shared work that become, on a working ranch, the foundation of everything else. They worked the morning together and separately in the afternoon, each managing their respective areas without needing to consult on every decision. And then in the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed and talked. They talked about the cattle and the accounts and the coming dry season, and the price reports in the Caldwell paper that Hector Brody brought over once a week, and gradually they talked about other things as well. They talked about the frontier and what it asked of people. They talked about the injustices that the territory carried in its bones, the land being stripped from the Comanche and the Kiowa in ways that Frank said plainly were wrong, and that made Minnie nod with the agreement of someone who had thought about this, and arrived at the same conclusion by her own route. They talked about Missouri eventually, and Frank told her more than he had said in the single summarizing sentence at the auction, about a father who ruled by fear and a mother who endured it and a younger brother who Frank had left behind when he ran at 17, and who had died 3 years later of a fever that Frank had sometimes wondered, in his darker moments, was partly despair. The telling of it was not easy. He told it in pieces, on different evenings, not all at once, and Minnie listened to each piece with the same quality of attention she gave to the account ledgers, fully present and entirely without judgment. On the evening he told her about his brother, she said nothing for a long time. Then she reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his, just briefly, the way you might press your hand against something that is real to confirm it is still there, and then she moved it back. He sat with the warmth of that for a long time after she had gone inside. There was something between them, clear and growing, that neither of them had named yet. This was not because they were unaware of it. It was because they were both people who had learned that naming something before it was ready could break it, and neither of them was willing to risk that. The thing that broke the careful architecture of their restraint was not a sunset or a dance or a moment of deliberate romance. It was a thunderstorm in early July and a crisis with the cattle. They had been expecting rain for 3 days. The sky had been building with the specific dark pressure of a summer storm, and Frank had spent those days moving the herd to higher ground and checking the water channels and reinforcing the stable. On the evening of July the 8th, the storm came in earnest, not the rolling variety that passed through in an hour, but the kind that settled over the territory and poured for the entire night, lightning cracking the sky open and thunder rolling in continuous waves across the flat land. Frank was in the stable when the south fence failed in the mud. He heard it, a specific sound that any cattle man knows, the creak and crack, and then the particular quality of silence that means a barrier has given way, followed almost immediately by the sound of cattle moving in the wrong direction. He was out of the stable before he had consciously decided to move, lantern in hand, into the full fury of the storm. He was not alone. Minnie was 3 steps behind him. She had heard it from the house and come out with her coat half on and her hair loose, and a coil of rope she had grabbed from the porch railing, and she ran through the rain to the broken fence line, with the practical urgency of someone who understands exactly what cattle scatter means for a ranch's future. And for the next 2 hours they worked in the rain and the lightning, rounding up the cattle and repairing the fence line with the materials they had on hand. Mud up to their knees and the lantern constantly threatening to go out, communicating in short, efficient sentences, and the occasional wordless coordination of 2 people who have already learned each other's patterns. When the last cattle were secured and the fence was braced well enough to hold until morning and the storm had settled into a steady hard rain rather than a fury, they stood in the stable doorway, both of them soaked entirely through, catching their breath. Frank looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing close because the doorway was narrow and neither of them had moved to create distance, and the lantern light was warm and unsteady, and her hair was dark and wet against her neck, and she was looking at him with those eyes that were never anything but entirely alive. He said, "Minnie." She said, "Frank." And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same quality of certainty she brought to everything else. And it was not tentative and it was not uncertain. It was 2 people who had been patient with each other, and with themselves for long enough, finally acknowledging something that had been true since April. When they stepped back from each other, both of them slightly breathless, the rain was still coming down and the cattle were still moving and the lantern light was still throwing its warm arc across the stable floor, and Frank said, "I should have done that in May." Minnie said, "You did it at exactly the right time." He looked at her. She said, "I needed to know you first. I needed to know who you were when the fence broke." He understood what she meant. She had needed to know who he was under pressure in the dark, in the literal middle of a crisis, before she was willing to let him fully in. He thought that was entirely reasonable, given everything he knew about where she had come from. He said, "Who am I?" she said, "the kind of man who runs toward the problem." The summer of 1878 on the Calloway ranch was, for the first time in Frank's memory, the season he most wanted to be fully present for. He had spent 6 years in this territory treating the work as the point and the life around the work as incidental, but something had shifted fundamentally. He woke before dawn and the first thing he was aware of was not the work that needed doing but the specific warmth of Minnie asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady, and he would lie in the dark for a few minutes just existing in the reality of it before getting up. She noticed this. She told him one morning while she was making coffee, "You lie there thinking very loudly every morning." He said, "I didn't know thinking had a volume." She said, "Yours does." He said, "What am I thinking about?" She turned from the stove and looked at him with the corner of a smile that she was not quite hiding and said, "I imagine that's your business." But she was smiling properly by the time she turned back to the stove. The ranch was prospering, not extravagantly, but solidly, in the way that good management and good land and good cattle, and two people who were genuinely competent produced. The combined acreage gave them more flexibility in grazing than Frank had ever had alone, and Minnie's accounting had revealed 3 places where money had been leaking out in inefficiencies that she corrected with a few adjustments to their purchasing arrangements, and one conversation with the Wichita cattle broker that Frank had told her would go nowhere, and that resulted in a better rate per head than they had been getting, which Frank acknowledged by saying, "I was wrong about that." Minnie said, "Yes, you were." He said, "You could take more satisfaction in that." She said, "I am taking exactly the right amount of satisfaction in it." This was the specific texture of their daily life, competent and direct and punctuated by a humor that ran underneath everything like the water that Frank's well drew from deep in the limestone, cold and clear and seemingly inexhaustible. They argued occasionally, cleanly, about specific things, and they resolved those arguments because both of them were interested in the resolution rather than in being right, which made a considerable difference. Frank had grown up in a house where arguments were never resolved, only escalated, and he had spent years after leaving Missouri afraid of his own capacity for conflict, pressing it down the way his father had pressed it, sideways into silence. Minnie's way of arguing, direct and specific and entirely without cruelty, was teaching him something he had not known he was still capable of learning. In August, they had a visit from someone Frank had not been expecting. He came on a Tuesday morning, riding a horse that was better than its rider's dust-covered appearance suggested, and he pulled up at the yard gate and called Frank's name in a way that made Frank, who was repairing a hitch on the wagon, go very still for a moment before he turned around. The man's name was Cobb, Daniel Cobb. He had been Frank's father's foreman in Missouri, the man who had enforced the old Calloway's will with fists and silence and the particular authority of someone who belongs entirely to whoever is paying him. Frank had been 17 years old when he ran from his father's house, and Daniel Cobb had been one of the primary reasons he was running. He looked older now, which was not surprising. It had been 12 years. But he had the same quality that Frank remembered, the quality of a thing that has no center of its own and takes its shape from whatever pressure is applied to it. Frank put down his tools and walked to the gate. Cobb said the old man was dead. He said this first, before anything else, as if he understood it was the piece of information most likely to determine whether Frank would listen to the rest. He said Thomas Calloway had died in March, of the heart, on his own land alone. He said Frank's father had left a will, and that the will included Frank despite everything, land and money both, a considerable sum, and that Cobb had been sent to find him by the Missouri lawyer handling the estate. Frank stood at the gate and looked at Cobb and felt the complicated machinery of his past run through him like a cold wind, the grief that is not quite grief, the relief that carries its own shame, the anger that has nowhere left to go when its object is dead. He said nothing for a long moment. Then Minnie came out of the house, because she had seen the stranger from the window, and she stood on the porch and looked at Frank's back and the way he was holding himself, and she said, "Frank, do you want me to come down?" He turned and looked at her, and the sight of her there on their porch in their yard, with the morning sun on her and that question in her voice, steady and entirely without anxiety, an offer of presence not pressure, did something that unlocked a rib he had not known was still held tight. He said, "Yes." She came down. Frank introduced her as his wife, which was true and also felt like the most significant thing he had said in several months. Cobb looked at her with the assessment of a man who categorizes people by their usefulness to whoever he currently works for, and Minnie looked back at him with the particular expression she reserved for people whose motives she was still in the process of determining. They brought Cobb inside and gave him coffee and listened to the full account. The estate was not small. Frank's father, for all his violence and darkness, had been a capable farmer, and 40 years of Kansas and Missouri farming had accumulated into land value and livestock, and cash that the lawyer's letter in Cobb's coat pocket summarized as approximately $11,000 in total assets. After Cobb left, with Frank's agreement to contact the Missouri lawyer and his refusal to have any further interaction with Cobb himself, Frank and Minnie sat at the kitchen table in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full. Minnie said, "You don't have to decide anything today." He said, "I know," she said, "but I think you should know that whatever you decide, it doesn't change anything here." He looked at her. She said, "I married you, Frank. I didn't marry your father's money, and I didn't marry the absence of it. So whatever you decide to do with it or not do with it, I want you to make that decision for yourself, not for the ranch and not for me." He sat with that for a long time. Eventually he said, "There's a kind of money that has bad things attached to it. That taints what you build with it." She said, "I think that depends on what you build." He said, "What would you do with it?" She said, "I would pay the debt entirely off, put a portion in reserve for hard years, and use the rest to expand the herd and repair the north stable that you told me last month is one bad winter from collapsing." He said, "That is a very practical answer." She said, "It is a practical situation." He said, "Minnie." She looked at him. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For not telling me how to feel about it. For not making it simple when it isn't simple." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Feelings aren't simple, but decisions can be, once you've sat with the feelings long enough." He wrote to the Missouri lawyer the following week. He engaged in the estate process and accepted the inheritance, and he did with it almost exactly what Minnie had said she would do, because her instincts were sound and her plan was good, and he was not the kind of man who ignored good sense in favor of pride. The ranch's finances moved into a new range of stability that felt, for the first time in Frank's 6 years in Kansas, genuinely secure rather than merely functional. He also did one other thing with a portion of the money that he did not tell Minnie about in advance. In September of 1878, when the fall roundup was done, and the cattle had been driven to Wichita and sold at the rate that Minnie had negotiated, and the resulting payment had come in, Frank told Minnie one morning that he needed to go to Caldwell for the day, and that she should not be concerned if he came back late. Minnie, who was not given to idle concern, told him to have a sensible day. He came back in the early evening with a package wrapped in brown paper and a slightly different quality of expression than he usually wore, something that sat closer to the surface than he normally permitted. He set the package on the kitchen table and stood back from it in the manner of someone who is more uncertain than they intend to appear. Minnie put down the account ledger and looked at the package and looked at him. He said, "It's for the house, or for you, both, I suppose." She unwrapped it. Inside was a crate of books, 12 of them, real books, novels and histories, and a volume on agricultural science, and a collection of American poetry that Frank had asked the Caldwell General Store to order in, which they had managed through a supplier in Wichita. Beneath the books, wrapped separately in cloth, was a small framed looking glass with a wooden border carved with a pattern of simple wildflowers. Minnie looked at the books and the looking glass for a long moment. She said, "The books are wonderful." He said, "I know you read when you could get things in Caldwell. I thought since we're further out now it's harder to get to town." She said, "And the mirror." He said, looking at a point slightly to the left of her face in the way that meant he was being more vulnerable than he liked to be, "You got ready for our wedding in a house without a proper mirror, and I thought that was wrong and I kept thinking about it." The kitchen was very quiet. Minnie set the looking glass down on the table with careful hands, and then she crossed the kitchen, and she kissed him in the manner of someone who has decided to be entirely unguarded for once, which was a quality in her that still had the power to completely overturn his composure, and he put his arms around her and held on. Later she hung the mirror in the bedroom and arranged the books on the shelf he built her that October, which was not the finest carpentry ever executed in Kansas, but was solid and well-braced, and exactly the right height. The fall moved into winter with the particular quality of a frontier winter, hard and beautiful, and requiring constant attention. They learned each other in all the dimensions that winter reveals in people, the interior selves that warm weather allows you to keep private, the ways that cold and darkness and confinement either erode a relationship or deepen it. They deepened. They played cards in the evenings with Hector Brody and his 12-year-old daughter Clara, who had been managing Hector's household since her mother died 4 years ago, and who reminded Minnie, when she thought about it, of herself at that age, capable and serious-eyed and doing the work of someone twice her years. Minnie began teaching Clara arithmetic and reading on Tuesday afternoons, which she had suggested to Hector as a practical arrangement, and which Clara had responded to with the fervent attention of a child who has been waiting for exactly this. Frank watched Minnie with Clara and added it to the list of things about her that were doing permanent work on him. In December, Minnie told Frank, on a quiet evening when the fire was going, and the snow outside was falling in the soft, unhurried way that made the world sound wrapped in wool, that she was pregnant. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, and she said it directly, sitting across from him with her hands in her lap and her eyes steady. And the directness of it and the steadiness of it were so completely in keeping with everything she was that it made the information land with extraordinary clarity, like a bell in a quiet room. Frank Calloway, who was not a man given to displays of emotion, sat forward in his chair and put his face in his hands for approximately 15 seconds. This was not distress. Minnie understood this. She waited. When he looked up, his eyes were bright, and he said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Minnie, that is the best thing you have ever told me." She said, "It is a considerable list." He said, "It is at the top." She said, "I thought you should know." He said, "Is there anything you need? What do you need?" "Whatever you need, she said. "I need you to stop making that face or I'm going to embarrass myself." He said, "What face?" She said, "The one that suggests you are an entirely different person than the one I have been watching for 8 months. He said, "I might be." She said, "Good. I like this one." The winter was long and the cold was serious, but the house was solid, and the supplies were adequate, and the cattle were managed with the care and attention that the combination of Frank's experience and Minnie's systematic planning produced. By January, they had learned that the Calloway Ranch was increasingly known in the county as one of the better managed operations, which brought inquiries from 2 neighboring landowners about leasing grazing rights during the spring, which Minnie evaluated in the account ledger and recommended accepting, which Frank did. Hector Brody, who came over on a Tuesday in January and ate supper with them, and was told about the baby over coffee, responded with the emotional generosity of a man who loves good news more than almost anything, by declaring that he had always known Frank would sort himself out, and that it was entirely due to his influence, which Frank accepted without comment and Minnie acknowledged with the corner of a smile. Clara, told separately by Minnie the following Tuesday, was quietly thrilled and asked a series of very practical questions about infant care that suggested she had been thinking about it carefully before the conversation ended. The baby was born in July of 1879, on a hot evening with a good midwife named Mrs. Bertha Crane from Caldwell in attendance, and it was a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed of a full head of dark hair like his mother's and gray-green eyes like his father's that were clear and already very much awake. They named him Thomas James Calloway, the Thomas for Minnie's father and the James for Frank's brother, and the naming was a piece of both their histories being brought forward into something new. Frank, who had been outside the bedroom door during the entire process in a state of suspended anxiety that he later described as the longest 2 hours of his life, was brought in to meet his son and stood holding him with the careful steadiness of someone handling something irreplaceable, which was exactly what he was doing, and looked at Minnie, who was pale and tired and entirely herself, and said, "He looks serious." Minnie said, "He came from serious people." Frank said he's going to be all right. Minnie said he already is. Thomas James Calloway, called Tom almost immediately, was a good baby in the specific ways that a baby is good, healthy and responsive, and possessed of a clear will that announced itself early. He was a child who watched the world with the attentive quality that his mother brought to all things, and who reached toward everything in the specific way that suggested he would, when he was old enough, want to know how it worked. The ranch grew with him. The herd expanded to over 100 head. The North Stable was rebuilt properly with the Missouri inheritance funds, and the result was significantly better than what it replaced. Frank took on a hired hand in the spring of 1880, a quiet young man of 19 named Eli who was solid and willing, and who, Frank noted with quiet approval, treated Minnie with the respectful matter-of-factness with which you treat someone who is clearly in charge of things. Minnie continued to manage the accounts and continued to teach Clara Brody on Tuesdays, and Clara, at 16 by 1882, had a mathematical fluency that made Minnie write, in a letter to a school in Wichita, a very specific recommendation on the girl's behalf that resulted in Clara being offered a place as a pupil teacher's assistant, which was not perfect but was a beginning, and which Clara accepted with a straightforward thank you to Minnie that carried the full weight of what it meant to her. Hector Brody cried at the small farewell dinner they gave for Clara in April of 1882. He cried and then denied it, and then said he had something in both eyes simultaneously, which Frank said was possible but statistically unlikely, which made Minnie laugh the real laugh, the sudden unguarded one that she still gave out selectively. And Frank, catching the sound of it across the dinner table, had the same response he always had, which was a quality of quiet, complete happiness that he had given up expecting life to produce. In October of 1882, on a morning when the first frost had laid itself across the grass, and the cattle were moving in their deliberate autumn way, and Tom, who was 3 years old and had strong opinions about breakfasts, was being managed by his father at the kitchen table while Minnie did the morning accounts. Minnie looked up from the ledger and watched Frank cut Tom's bread into the shapes the child had requested with the seriousness he brought to everything, precise and patient and entirely present. And she put down her pencil. Frank looked up from the bread. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have thought many times about the auction in April of 1878, about standing on that platform and watching all those men look past me." He was quiet, listening. She said, "I was ashamed, not of myself exactly, but of the situation of needing it. I went home from the auction thinking that if not even one person had looked at me, I was going to lose the farm and there was nothing left after that." He said, "Minnie," she said, "no, let me finish. I want to say this properly." She looked at him across the kitchen, across the table where their son was cheerfully destroying his bread, across the 4 years they had built together in this house, in this land, in this life. She said, "You were the one who did not look away. And I have known since approximately 3 days after our wedding that the fact that 37 men looked past me was the most useful thing that ever happened to me. Because if any one of them had not looked past me, I would not be here. And I have not been able to imagine for a long time now being anywhere else." Frank Calloway, who was not a man given to displays, set down the bread knife. He looked at his wife with the same quality of attention he had given her on the platform in April of 1878, the same total, unbroken, completely certain regard, and said, "I have thought about that day 100 times. About what I would have been riding home to if I had looked away." He shook his head slightly. He said, "I don't know what I was supposed to be at the auction that morning. I don't know why I looked at you the way I did instead of the way everyone else did. I just know that looking at you and seeing you, actually seeing you, was the clearest thing I have ever done in my life. It was like the one moment where I was paying the right kind of attention." Tom, who had been listening with the limited comprehension of a 3-year-old, but the full attention of a child who senses the importance of what is happening around him, said with the gravity of someone making an important contribution, Bread. Both his parents looked at him. Frank handed him the bread. Minnie put her hand over her mouth, and then she was laughing, the real laugh, and Frank was laughing, and Tom looked between them with the satisfied expression of someone who has successfully navigated a conversation and received bread. The winter of 1882 was cold, but the house was warm. Frank had extended the main room by several feet the previous summer, giving them more space around the hearth, and the shelf of books that he had given her in September of 1878 had expanded considerably, added to by Minnie's own purchases and by Frank, who had discovered that he enjoyed reading in the evenings and had developed specific opinions about history books that he was willing to defend at length. They read to Tom in the evenings before bed, and he began to talk with the particular early fluency of a child who has been talked to constantly and honestly and well. By the spring of 1883, Minnie was pregnant again. This time she told Frank on a morning when he was checking the fence line at the south pasture, and she brought him coffee, which she did sometimes when he was working close to the house, and she handed him the cup and said, while he was looking at the fence and not at her, "We're going to need the lean-to room properly finished this time." He looked at the fence for one more second and then looked at her. He said, "When?" She said, "October, I think." He said, "The room will be done by August." It was done by July. He worked on it in the evenings after the day's main work was finished, and Eli helped when time allowed. And by the 1st of July, it was a proper room with a good solid door that hung correctly and a window facing east to catch the morning light. And Frank stood in it and looked at the eastern window and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has built something for a purpose they love. The baby born in October of 1883 was a girl, which neither of them had directed the universe toward, but both received with complete joy. She was born in the same room her brother had been born in, attended by the same Bertha Crane who had attended Tom's arrival, and who pronounced her a fine, healthy child with a good voice, which was demonstrated immediately and with considerable conviction. They named her Ruth Ellen Calloway, the Ruth from the Book of Ruth that Minnie had always thought was the most complete story of loyalty, and the Ellen for Frank's mother, who had been in Frank's past a complicated figure, a woman who had endured a great deal and done the best she could with what she had, and whose name Frank offered for the baby quietly, and which Minnie received without requiring explanation. Ruth Ellen Calloway arrived in the world with the same dark hair as her mother and father both, and the temperament of someone who has already decided the world is interesting. Tom, who was 4 by then and had been briefed extensively on the concept of a sibling, received her with the mixture of proprietary pride and barely concealed bewilderment that 4-year-olds bring to everything that disrupts their established understanding of how things work. He told her very seriously on the second day that her name was Ruth and that she was small. She blinked at him. He told her that was all right. The ranch in the middle years of the 1880s was a thing Frank occasionally stood back and looked at with the specific disbelief of someone who knows exactly where they came from and cannot entirely reconcile it with where they are. Not because it was extravagant, it was not extravagant. It was a working ranch in Kansas, and it had the particular beauty of working things, functional and specific and earned. But it was a good life. It was, he thought on the best days, exactly the life he would have designed if someone had handed him the opportunity at 17, running from Missouri with $100 and a set of teeth-gritted ambitions, and asked him to describe what he was running toward. He had not known then that what he was running toward was this. He had not known that it included a woman who argued about cattle rotation and kept 12 ledgers and laughed selectively and lay beside him in the mornings while he thought loudly and told him things that were true even when they were complicated, especially when they were complicated. He had not known. But she had been there, waiting, in the specific way that good things wait, not passively but persistently, surviving until they were found. The spring auction of 1878 became a story they told, eventually. Not often, and not in the sentimental manner of a story designed to impress, but in the honest manner of people acknowledging the specific shape of their history. They told it to Tom when he was old enough to understand it, and Tom, who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quality of paying careful attention, listened to it with the gravity of a child absorbing something important about who he was and where he came from. He asked, at the end of it, why the men had looked past her. Minnie said because they were looking for something they had already decided they wanted and I didn't match the picture. Tom thought about this. He said, "That seems wrong." Frank said, "It is wrong." Tom said, "But then how did you know?" Frank looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at Frank. Frank said, "I didn't have a picture, I just looked." Tom considered this for a long time with the concentrated seriousness of a 9-year-old processing information with real application, and then he said, "I think that's better." Minnie said, "Yes, it is." In the fall of 1885, with Tom at 6 and Ruth at 2, and the ranch operating at its most productive level yet, Hector Brody came to Sunday dinner looking older than he had the week before, and told them over the meal that he had received a letter from Clara in Wichita, where she had been working for 3 years as a schoolteacher proper, not an assistant but a full teacher at one of the city's newer schools, and that the letter said she was engaged to marry a man named Samuel Reyes, who was a printer and a decent man, and that she was happy. Hector said this last part with the specific tone of someone reporting the only thing that truly matters. Minnie set down her fork and looked at Hector with considerable warmth and said, "That is very good news." Hector said, "She asks about you all. She says to tell you, Minnie, that she remembers everything you taught her." Frank watched Minnie's face do the thing it did when she was moved by something, a quick internal shift that was over almost before it was visible, the discipline of someone who has spent a lifetime holding things carefully. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, the way she had done to him on that long-ago evening when he had told her about his brother. She looked at him. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The years after that moved with the quality of years in a good life, not slowly, not the dragging tedium of endurance, but with a fullness that made each season distinct and present. Tom grew into a serious boy who was good with the cattle and better with books, and who argued with his mother about accounts, and with his father about the correct way to break a horse, both of them wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and both of them entirely themselves. Ruth grew into a girl of specific and vivid personality, possessed of the directness of both her parents but applied with a warmth that was entirely her own, who told you what she thought with the same candor her mother employed, but with a smile that softened nothing and was nevertheless irresistible. Frank, watching his daughter at 4 years old, explained to Eli the hand why he was watering the kitchen garden incorrectly, and exactly how he should be doing it instead, and watching Eli listen with genuine attention and then make the correction, thought, "She is going to be absolutely exhausting for anyone who cannot keep up with her, and she is going to be magnificent." He told Minnie this that evening. Minnie said, "She gets it from you," he said. "She gets it from you." They looked at each other with the particular harmony of two people who have been honestly known by each other for long enough that argument about such things is simply a form of affection. In 1887, nearly a decade after the spring auction, the Calloway Ranch was a recognized and respected operation in Sumner County. Frank's herd had grown to nearly 200 head. They employed 3 hands year-round now, Eli being the senior of them, and 2 seasonal workers during drive preparation. The house had expanded twice, and the addition Frank had built in 1885 gave them a proper dining room large enough for the Sunday dinners that had become a fixture. Hector Brody, a regular attendant, occasionally other neighbors, the specific hospitality of a house where people felt welcome and fed. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed. In the fall of 1887, 9 years after that April morning, They sat on the porch on an evening when the last of the harvest light was still on the land, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and the children were inside. Tom at 8 doing his lessons, and Ruth at 4 in the process of testing the structural integrity of everything she could reach. Minnie had a cup of tea and Frank had the Caldwell paper, and neither of them was reading or drinking. They were watching the light change on the grass with the comfortable attention of two people who have earned their evenings. Minnie said not to mark the occasion particularly, but because it was present in her, 9 years ago next April. Frank said, "Yes," she said, "I was thinking about it today, about what I thought when I woke up that morning, that April morning in 1878. He said, "What did you think?" She said, "I thought I was going to lose everything. I thought I was at the end of everything I had." He was quiet. She said, "I was wrong about the end part. I was right that I was at the end of something, but it was the end of the wrong life, not the right one." Frank put down the paper. He looked at his wife, at the woman he had seen on a platform in the April sun of 1878, and recognized in one long, unhurried look as someone worth knowing, someone who deserved to be seen and had not yet been, and he said, "Minnie." She turned and looked at him. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "I have been trying for 9 years to find the words for what happened that morning at the auction, not what happened between us. Not the practical arrangement or the proposal. I mean the moment before any of that, when I saw you on that platform and all those men had looked past you and I couldn't look away." She was still. He said, "I think what happened was that I recognized you. Before I knew your name or your history or anything you were capable of, I recognized you. Like something in me already knew that you were the person I had been building this ranch for without knowing it. Like every post I drove and every fence I mended, and every year I spent trying to make that land into something worth living on, I was building it for someone, and you were the person." The light was changing on the land, the way it does in the fall in Kansas, golden and serious, the specific light of endings that are also openings. Minnie set down her tea. She said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Frank Calloway." He said, "Yes," she said, "that is the most words you have said at once in 9 years. He said, "I've been working up to it." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stepped forward from a crowd of men who looked away, who had spoken plainly and listened completely, and built something with her, not for her, alongside her, who had held their children with the terrified reverence of someone who cannot believe the luck of it, who drove toward broken fences in storms and told the truth about his past and hung a mirror in their bedroom because she had gotten ready for their wedding without a proper one. She said, "I would like to tell you something too." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I spent the first 24 years of my life doing everything I had to do and none of what I wanted to do, because there was no space between the two. My father was not a cruel man, but he was an absent one, and I learned young that whatever was going to happen for me was going to come from me alone. I learned to be alone, Frank. I learned it all the way down in the bones of it, and I stopped expecting anything different." She looked at her hands for a moment, the same capable hands that had been working since she could hold a tool. She said, "You were the thing I stopped expecting. Not the land and not the money and not the problem solved. You. A person who looked at me and did not look away. A person who sat across a kitchen table and went through my debt ledger with me and then asked me to marry him, not despite everything that ledger showed about my situation, but after seeing the full honest truth of it." She looked at him. She said, "You made me want to be here, Frank. In this life. In this house with the good well and the books on the shelf and the children who argue about everything and are absolutely right too. You made me want to be present in it rather than just surviving it, and I did not know I was missing that until you gave it to me." The land was settling into its evening. Somewhere in the south pasture, cattle moved with their slow certainty. Inside the house, a child's voice rose briefly and was answered and went quiet again. Frank Calloway reached across the space between their chairs and took his wife's hand, not briefly this time but fully, the way you hold something you are not letting go of. He said, "I am glad I went to that auction." She said, "I am glad you did not look away," he said. "I never will." She tightened her hand around his, and they sat in the fall light of the frontier, on the porch of the life they had built together from $43 and $400 of debt, and one man stepping forward from a crowd, and the light moved across the land in its slow and ancient way, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and the story of two people who had found each other in the specific way that honest people find each other. By accident and by choice, and by the grace of one person refusing to look away, continued into the evening with the quiet fullness of a life that is entirely, completely, and genuinely good. In the years that followed, the Calloway ranch would grow further still. Tom would become a rancher himself, taking over much of the operation by the time he was 17, with the combined capability of both his parents running through him. Ruth would grow into the force of nature her father had predicted, and would one day run the accounts herself with a precision that made Minnie put down the ledger and say, with the particular satisfaction of someone watching something continue, that the ranch was in good hands. Hector Brody would grow old gracefully and attend every Sunday dinner until he was physically unable, by which point Clara had returned to Caldwell with Samuel and their two children, and Hector had the specific happiness of a man surrounded by family he loves in his last years, which is a gift that not everyone receives. Eli would stay on the Calloway ranch for 20 years total, quiet and reliable, the kind of person who makes good places possible. And Frank and Minnie Calloway would grow old together in the way that people grow old who have been genuinely known by each other, not by diminishment, but by accumulation, each year adding to rather than taking from the specific understanding of who they were to each other. Their arguments remained clean, and their silences remained full, and their evenings on the porch continued as long as the weather permitted and sometimes beyond it, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the land they had built together breathe in its dark and patient way. There was a morning in the spring, many years later, when they were both well past the age where anyone would have asked them to stand on an auction platform, when Frank came inside from the early morning cattle check to find Minnie at the kitchen table with the accounts, and the same dark eyes, and the same capable hands, and the same absolute presence she had always had. And he stood in the doorway and looked at her in the unbroken way he had been looking at her since April of 1878. And she looked up and saw him looking. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "You have that look." He said, "What look?" She said, "The one you had at the auction." He smiled. The real smile that she had eventually learned was one of the most valuable things she had ever been given, and he said, "I was just making sure you were still here." Minnie Holloway Calloway, who had stood on a platform in the April sun and been looked past by 37 men and found by one, looked at her husband across the kitchen of the life they had made and said, "I am always here, Frank." He said, "I know." He sat down across from her and poured himself coffee from the pot she had already made, and the morning came through the eastern window in the way it always did, clear and specific and full of the particular quality of a day that will be what you make it. And they were both exactly where they were supposed to be, in the life they had chosen together, with everything resolved and everything possible, and the land outside green and endless in the early light of another good year.